Hey everybody, how are you? Today we're talking about management and management theories. Yes, fairly boring. Not necessarily a topic that garners much excitement or enthusiasm, theories. Not necessarily talking about effective management or great management, but really the foundational elements of management. So why do we study this, and why do I often talk about it? It's a little bit boring. When we talk about foundational, it's almost like you want to build a house. And you don't want to go through the blueprint stage, but you want to see what the house is going to look like. Kind of the same concept. Management is like, well, we want to manage, but we don't want to really learn how to manage. We don't want to utilize or create these theories, modify the theories that underpin what we know about management. However, so much of management is about the histories of management. What do I mean by histories? What's worked and what hasn't worked. So we research what has worked in relation to management so that we can determine what may work in the future. There's a great saying that said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it may rhyme. I think that was some Will Rogers or something. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Which means that if we understand what has worked in the past and what hasn't worked in the past, then that is a great prelude that what can happen in the future. Of course, we need to assess and adjust. But it really talks about some aspects that we can learn from the past to hopefully do it better in the future. So since going back in history and looking at these theories, by the way, is an idea. It's a thought. It's one person's idea of what would work or what didn't work. So we can all come up with a theory. We can come up with a theory at the end of this presentation. So it is just our thought. The better theory is one that's based on research and analysis. So we garner more interest, we garner more influence based on how well we present our points of view, our theories. But since we're talking about theories and associated with management, I thought we'd make it a little bit fun. I hope we talk about it in a fun manner, but some of the pictures that I include here are hopefully intended to be a bit more fun. It's pictures of Disneyland and Walt Disney. The funnest place on earth, as they often say. And so the pictures here are to enliven our presentation a bit as we talk about a bit more boring of a discussion related to management. However, that being said, it is important that we learn about these histories so that we can create futures that may be a bit more positive. So let's talk and let's move forward of our presentation on management. What we'll first talk about, as you know, I like quotes. Quotes are important because they get us to think. They get us to analyze the information that's presented to us and to analyze it in a way that we get certain results. Results matter. Results matter because no matter how much we learn, at some point we have to take what we learn and put it into practice. And only when we put it into practice can we see what the results are. There, in many organizations, are a host of plans that may never see the light of day, but they're plans on, if this happens, we will do this. I think that works out quite well. We have to have a plan for any type of what we would call contingencies. We often don't know what the contingencies are until a plan is put into action. Well, you may often wonder why so many plans go awry. And we often will say, well, it's because the person didn't put the research into it. They didn't put the time into it. They didn't put the resources into it. Sometimes they do. But you often, not always, but often, can't predict with a high degree of certainty what the results are going to be. As much as you know somebody, have we often had a conversation with somebody and then say, wow, I never thought they'd react like that. But you know this person. How did you not predict with a high degree of certainty that the person would result, that the actions would result from that conversation? Or, I didn't think they'd take it like that. But if you know this person, you should, shouldn't you? You should know the result that you're going to get. But because we deal with humans, and human emotions are so difficult to understand, certainly to predict, then we often don't know what the results are going to be. However, we need to do our what's called due diligence. We need to spend as much research as possible to try to predict what the results are going to be. And then we have to very, very quickly modify our approach based on the results that are seen. So results do matter. That at the end of the day, after we've exerted considerable efforts in relation to our plan, our progress, once we start seeing the results, we have to make sure that those results are what were expected. And if they're not, then we have to modify our approach to make sure that we get the results that we expected, because results do matter. At the end of the day, we're going to be judged by the results. Management is judged by the results. You can follow this presentation. I have so many more on YouTube about how to be an effective manager. I did one about how to be an efficient manager. Somebody who does their job well. They may not be the most effective, but they manage their resources well. So we can learn as much as we can about management. But until you're in the arena, as Richard Nixon once said, until you're in the arena, you certainly don't know whether your actions or principles or policies or practices actually work. But we try our best to understand what the results may be. But again, at some point we have to assess and reassess, assess and modify based on the results that happen once we institute a plan or an action or strategy. So results do matter. Agenda. We're going to talk about defining management and managerial endeavors. We're going to look at the seminal events in management, the major approaches to management, and we're going to give a big summary. Again, what we're looking for here is to understand management, what management is. This understanding, this foundation, should provide us with some information to make better strategies. To take into context, 40 years ago they had the same situation, and this is what they did, and this part of it worked and this didn't. So when I do it this year or next year and 5 years, I'm going to take that into account, and I'm going to do it a little bit differently based on the repercussions or aftermath of those management strategies that they took. It is quite wise to follow that. I have a saying here, management should be fun, like being at Disneyland. It really should. That's why I want to create these types of pictures. The picture you see here is of Walt Disney and Mickey. It's as you walk into Disneyland. We go to Disneyland every year. And it's one of my favorite pictures. If I was downstairs, I'd show you. I actually have kind of this glass a figurine that the kids bought of Walt Disney and Mickey Mouse. Interestingly enough, Walt Disney said towards the end, he goes, we should never forget that it all started with the mouse. So even though he was the master of creating, he was the visionary genius that created so much of what we know as Disney and Disneyland, he always gave credit to Mickey Mouse, and he said that all credit should go. It all started with the mouse. And there is the mouse. Definition. Management, as we've learned in some of the other videos, is about allocating resources efficiently and effectively to accomplish a goal. What is efficient? Efficient uses the least amount of resources. Effectively means that it works. When we talk about results matter, we're talking about effectiveness. We're talking about effectiveness. We're talking about making sure that no matter what we do, at the end of the day, it actually works. What are some of these seminal endeavors that we see? We look at the Egyptian pyramids. It took 100,000 workers 20 years to build the pyramids. Some people think that it was an overnight kind of sensation. It took 20 years to build the pyramids. It took over 100,000 people. But that was a management endeavor. It was a management marvel, in fact, to create those pyramids that still exist centuries later. They exist because of how well they're built. They were built well, not only because of the workers, but because of the managers that had to oversee the work that these individuals devoted their lives to in order to build these temples. Remember, back in those days, the average person didn't live to the ages that we live today. In fact, 30, 40 would have been an age sometime back then when people would die because of the various diseases which we couldn't cure, illnesses, plagues. The food wasn't as good. So for a variety of reasons, people did not live that long. In fact, even in the 1930s, the average person never lived past 65. So you can imagine hundreds and thousands of years ago, some of the environments upon which these people lived. So 20 years would have been a whole lifetime of working for some of these individuals. The Great Wall of China, I don't know how long that took or how many workers, but It is a marvel. It's one of the few things that if you were in outer space that you could see. You would be able to see the Great Wall of China. You can also see Las Vegas when it's lit up. It's amazing, right? But to build the architectural engineering marvel that it took to design and then build the Great Wall of China, very similar to the pyramids, required great management abilities. Some seminal events about management. Adam Smith, who was from Scotland, wrote The Wealth of Nations. It was what we would call a seminal event, a seminal piece of literature. And he talked about how you need to divide labor so that people can specialize. He talked about aspects like the invisible hand, and he talked about how people are motivated to accomplish something great on their own, and that's where this invisible hand. He also talked about competition and capitalism. He really was one of the founding members of management and how best to manage people to accomplish a goal. The Industrial Revolution was also something that relied somewhat heavily on Adam Smith, but the Industrial Revolution occurred in the 1800s mainly because technology, science, had advanced to a point where we could create large buildings which had some kind of mechanism, machinery, to produce products that beforehand were only created or produced by hand. Now they could be produced by machines. The sewing machine is yet one example. The cotton gin is another. So instead of making clothes by hand, you could make clothes by machine and build so many more clothes. At the end of the day, you could create an industry where hundreds, if not thousands, of people worked to create, if not millions, of pieces of clothing. It required managers to hire, yes, fire, but also to motivate and inspire workers to work well. The working conditions in the Industrial Revolution were not good, and there was many abuses during this period. One reason why unions came in the 20th century, because employees weren't treated as well. However, they did follow some management practices. So to say that they didn't would not be true. They did follow management practices, just not the right practices. I think if they would have followed the practices we have today, it would have been much different. But never forget, we often look in the past and talk about how wrong the past was. Had we not gone through the wrongs of the past, we may not have the rights of the future. And that's an important aspect to consider. Yes, management in the past was wrong, but because of what was wrong, we fixed it over the years. It would have been great to fix it the first time. We certainly just didn't know. So machine power during this time substituted for human power. And we needed these managers to forecast demand to ensure that there was enough materials on hand to assign tasks. It really was the growth of management. As I often say, in the 1700s, about 90% of people worked in agriculture. So it was very much of an agricultural world. And as a result, there wasn't as much management. Management often came from our parents or for those we worked with. There really wasn't a high degree of management during these periods. It was kind of like the I say you do philosophy back then, and that's what happens when you work for families or have a family business. But as people moved away from the farms because technology came into place that allowed farmers to produce many more crops and products with fewer people, those fewer people moved to the cities because now the businesses needed employees to run the new machines that were being created as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Interesting picture is one of my favorite. Talks about how we all have to work together in order to accomplish a goal. Teamwork is an important aspect. Obviously, an organization is created because we need more than one person to create a product or service. The more that we can work conducively, the better chance we have of being efficient and effective. Major approaches to management. There's many different ones. By the way, this is a picture that doesn't exist anymore. This is a picture of the 24,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's now been replaced. But it's one of, as we mentioned in the last slide, seminal. It's one of the seminal rides at Disneyland. It exists to, in one sense or another, just not that type of emphasis. I believe it's the name of the new writer escapes me, but it'll come to me. Major approaches to management: scientific, general administrative, quantitative, organizational behavior systems. All of these aspects and the contingency, all of these aspects we're going to talk about, these are the events in management that a considerable amount of work was devoted towards to better understand how to operate during these types of systems. For instance, the scientific management was really developed by Frederick Taylor, and he said that there's a science in the way we should manage people. In other words, we should look at facts, statistic, even logic to determine how to manage it. We don't really rely on human emotion. We'll get to that in a second. But it's really very much a numbers game in order to manage people. He said that the science is the way to do a job. Follow the science. We've heard that lately with the pandemic, follow the science. He said that you should scientifically select and train each person, that there should be a regimented process that you should follow when hiring somebody. That's going to produce the best type of results. He did believe that you should cooperate with workers to ensure work is done. Cooperate is somewhat of a loose term. It was much more during his time, much more regimented, even forced. And then he also believed that you should divide work equally between management and workers. That doesn't exist as much anymore. What's important, though, is that managers do different work than workers. The goal of a manager is to get work done through people. The goal of a worker is to get work done themselves. Scientific management. Still followed today. When we look at time and motion studies and those aspects, it's really looking at this should take you this long to accomplish the job. And that brought us to general administrative. This is some of the concepts about the four functions of management: of planning, organizing, coordinating, controlling. Henry Fayol and Max Weber were two individuals who really looked at, well, there should be a way that we follow to administer work. And so they came up with these concepts about planning. We've heard, and I've done a video on planning, we've heard about an hour spent planning saves 3 in execution. And the best example about planning that we can come up with is if you want to drive from California to Vermont, you can get in your car and certainly get on a freeway, and at some point you're going to get to Vermont. It may not be the best route. But if you plan out where the direction or the roads that you want to follow, you can probably get there quicker, especially if you look ahead and say, oh, on this road it's going to be closed, on this road it's going to be busy, and so you create a plan that gets you there in the quickest possible manner. That's what the administrative aspects of management were, to look at planning, organizing, coordinating, controlling. Max Weber talked about bureaucracy, something that we still see today. Bureaucracy is often thought of in a negative term. In some ways it should be. A bureaucracy is meant to facilitate the work of the organization. However, we often think that it becomes more controlling of the work in the organization. As a result, bureaucracy is not looked at in a positive viewpoint. But though bureaucracy isn't, there are some other philosophies that our friend Max Weber came up with, and he looked at division of labor, like we talked about earlier. He looked at hierarchy. There should be a hierarchy of tasks, duties, and yes, individuals within a firm. In other words, we should know who our supervisor is. A supervisor should know who their manager is. A manager should know who their director is. And their director should know who their executive is, if the organization is big enough. And there should be detailed rules and procedures. This is where bureaucracy comes into play. The problem with a rule is, as they often say, it's another word for no. So you have to make sure that the rules are not only specific, but they're germane to the task at hand. It's not always the case. Sometimes we see a rule that's been in play for 5 or 10 years. It's outlived its usefulness, but it's still a rule that has to be followed. When I started one of my last jobs, I had to do various reports. I finally asked, who gets these reports and what do they do with them? And we knew who gets the reports. That's who we send them to. But as far as what they do with them, we ask the person, what do you do with this report once you get it? Oh, I file it away. But yet it could take hours, if not days, to complete this report that somebody else really has found little use of, or at least little use of now. Administrative is an important aspect of management, as is the quantitative approach. This evolved from management and statistical military solutions during World War II. So they looked at processes in minute detail and figured out how best those processes could be followed. We used these statistics and optimization and information models, computer simulations even, and critical path. We looked at all of these number-based approaches so that at the end it can tell us that this is the number to follow. By number, it could be as easy as risk. We've done the analysis and you have a 97% chance of success. Most people would say, I'm going to do it at 97%. At 3 out of 100, I won't be a success. I can take those odds. It's not as prevalent today, though, unfortunately. Management's unfamiliar with statistics. If you were to ask a manager to do a t-test, an ANOVA, regression analysis, a high percentage, probably over 95%, couldn't do it. So if you're unfamiliar with statistics, you're probably not going to follow that process. We've seen that behavioral problems are much more apparent in today's world. And we'll talk about that because the organizational behavior aspect has dominated in some ways our world. This is a picture of the haunted house because organizational behavior is one that vexes even the most prominent of organizational behavior specialists. We often don't know. The word is abyss. We go into the abyss. Organizational behavior has become more prominent, maybe the most prominent today, because it's more about feelings today. It's more about how we feel, how you made me feel, as opposed to get the work done, or no matter what we feel, we have to ensure that this is the result we expect, or that we must work for these types of results. But feelings have so overtaken the workplace today that some organizations go out of business because maybe employees don't feel as good about themselves or where they work, as opposed to, let's look at the work that we have to do first and how to accomplish it, even if we don't feel the greatest about how we have to accomplish it or why we have to accomplish it. It's concerned with the actions and behaviors of people, of course. It wants people to feel good about themselves and about where they work. The thought is, if you work on organizational behavior, and if people feel good about themselves, who they are, where they want to be, where they want to go, that they'll perform better in the job. Research is mixed about that. There's some studies that find that if people are happy with their work, they'll be happy as an individual. Others that say if you're happy as an individual, you're going to be happy with your work. Where do I stand? I believe if people are happy, no matter where you put them, they'll be happy as well. I also believe that if people are unhappy, but if you create an environment where they may be a bit happier, or at least less unhappy, that may work as well. The point is that we've got to create a workplace that is conducive for people to work, that they like going to work. It's a great story about a person who went to a certain church, and they were saying, well, why do you go to that church? You're not of that denomination. They go, I go to that church to see my friends. It's very similar to going to a certain restaurant or a certain bar or whatever it may be. You like going because of the way they treat you when you walk in there. It doesn't mean you're a happy person walking in. It means that once you're in, you're happier. Maybe not as happy as you should be, but at least you're happier. This comes from that people are important. They're important assets for our organization. What we've realized today and over the last couple of years is that employees aren't as important as they used to be. We can get robots and artificial intelligence to do that. That does not mean that employees are not important to a degree. It means that they're not as important as they used to be. Employers have other options rather than hiring a full-time employee. They can hire a contractor or a consultant, part-timer. Or they can hire a robot or artificial intelligence. I say hire because I'm trying to get human resource and other professionals, including operations managers, to learn about those aspects. they are important. Organizational behavior, an important and growing aspect of our world and organizations. Systems approach. The picture here is indicative of systems, kind of a Star Trek, when they talk about the galaxy. And that's in some ways what we see systems approach is. It started in the 1960s, and it really came about where there's this independent or interdependent systems of individuals, groups, attitudes, and structures. And if you can learn about how each relates to the other, then hopefully you create an overall system, galaxy, where everything works conducively. It's the coordination of this interdependent work activities where you work together to accomplish goal. We see that people don't work together as well as they used to. In fact, we see that our world is less about teams and more about individuals. I mentioned some time ago about everybody wants a name that's different and unique, and if it's the same name as someone else, they want to spell it differently. And I think that's great, and they should. But the point is, we seem to emphasize more that makes us unique and more individualistic than actually what we have in common. There is a greater push today to have an individualistic streak in the way that we conduct our lives, as opposed to being part of a culture or a team. Positive or negative, who's to say? But it seems like we're moving in that direction. So the systems approach is a good approach. It's one that's still in vogue and used today, and it really talks about how different systems work together. You may see this approach when you see something like accounting isn't working with HR, they don't get along. That's a systems approach that a manager would come in and address. And contingency situational approach. Again, the picture's indicative. That's a picture of the Matterhorn mountain. That is at Disneyland. And the situational contingency I often look at as a mountain. If you find yourself on the top of the mountain and not knowing how to get down, what's the alternative or contingent approach to do that? If you find yourself in a situation that you don't want to be, you have to have what we often call a plan B, another plan. And so it's based on, of course, your organization's size and technology. But I often just call it options. You've got to have options in life. We don't know if the approach is going to result in the action that we expect. But what we can control is our response to the events once our plan is activated. And that's what we really need to look at. I've told so many people this issue of options, that in relation to a job, if you have a job and you're not looking for your next job, then you're doing yourself a disservice. It doesn't mean you have to take that job, but it means that you have to continually look for a job. That's a contingency plan. We all must have a contingency plan. Almost like what they call a go bag, which is a bag of stuff that if something bad happens to you, you can grab that bag and leave, whether it's money, passports, whatever it may be, medicines. But you have a go bag. This is everything I need if I have to leave on a quick basis. And leads us to the summary. The summary is that management is about resource allocation, as we know, to accomplish a goal. We want to do it efficiently and effectively. However, we've looked at 6 different aspects associated with management, and we should conclude that we need a fluid, flexible approach depending on structure, product or service, location, etc. One size doesn't fit all. But we need to understand the various options that we have, which we talked about for the last few minutes. And based on the options that we've had, one of those strategies we should implement more often, we're seeing a combination thereof. It leads us to the very last, which is what matters is that you tried to be good and tried to do good. That's what management is largely about. It's trying. And being able to assess and adapt in a real-time, rapid manner on something that doesn't work, but can work. If we as managers at the end, no matter what we've tried and retried, no matter what policy, procedure, theory we followed, at the end we have to say that we've tried. We really tried to be good, And if you try to be good, you often have a chance to do good. That's my hope for you all, is to be a good person and do something good in management. So many people depend on you as a manager or supervisor to do good in what you do. If you do good, people we work with, really have a chance to be good as well. Enjoy the day, everybody. Take care.